In this video, I want to read a short passage from Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. It's a short passage from pages 126 and 127. It is related to human mind, thinking, and daydreaming. Quote, the painter Kramskoy has a remarkable painting entitled The Contemplator. It depicts a forest in winter, and in the forest, standing all by himself on the road, in deepest solitude, a stray little peasant in a ragged kaftan and bast shoes. He stands as if he were lost in thought, but he is not thinking, he is contemplating something. If you nudged him, he would give a start and look at you as if he had just woken up, but without understanding anything. It's true that he would come to himself at once, and yet, if he were asked what he had been thinking about while standing there, he would most likely not remember, but would most likely keep hidden away in himself the impression he had been under while contemplating. These impressions are dear to him, and he is most likely storing them up imperceptibly, and even without realizing it. Why and what for, of course, he does not know either. Perhaps suddenly, having stored up his impressions over many years, he will drop everything and wander off to Jerusalem to save his soul, or perhaps he will suddenly burn down his native village, or perhaps he will do both. There are plenty of contemplators among the people. Very interesting passage. I want to point out that Dostoevsky's insistence that contemplation is different from thinking, and this parallels and confirms, it corroborates with William James's discussion of varieties of thinking. And William James, in his Principles of Psychology and in his briefer version of that, he talks about deliberate thinking, that thinking can be deliberate and pointing towards an end, going towards an end with a purpose in mind, with an overarching purpose in mind, or it could be non-deliberative or irresponsible thinking. Irresponsible thinking is when we let the images come to our mind and let one image link to or evoke the next image, and the relationship between these subsequent or consecutive images are not regulated by an overarching goal, like in the case of deliberate thinking. So in William James, we have the distinction between deliberate thinking and irresponsible thinking, or relatively passive thinking. And in Dostoevsky, we have the distinction between contemplation and thinking. And contemplation, Dostoevsky's contemplation and William James's irresponsible or unintentional thinking is close to the contemporary construct mind-wandering or daydreaming. The other thing I want to point out from this passage is that these impressions are dear to him. The contemplator or the daydreamer has a relationship with these images, but he doesn't really understand that relationship. He doesn't really know why these images come to him. He only knows that he shouldn't share them with other people, or he has that intuition that there's a personal relationship between him and the images, and this relationship, or what these images say about him, is not consistent with his role in society, with his ostensive, apparent role, with his public image. So for that reason, he shouldn't share the images with other people. But he continues to build up these images in his mind, just like collecting different pieces of the puzzle. And a large puzzle is being constructed over years, and he keeps adding pieces to this puzzle until one day he might see the big picture. He might figure out what the puzzle is telling him, what the puzzle wants him in terms of action, inviting him to a kind of action that might be completely inconsistent and destructive to his previous public responsibilities, to his previous public roles. And Dostoevsky gives the example of going on a pilgrimage, leaving everything behind, cutting the ties between his current life and his past life and his current life, or perhaps burning down his native village, which is not just cutting down the ties, but also destroying the place where his current role has been given to him. This book was published in 1880, a year before Dostoevsky's death. And we see insights in these kinds of books in literature that we cannot find in contemporary research on mind wandering. If you look at the current research on mind wandering done in cognitive neuroscience, the impoverished nature of these discussions, the simplicity is almost insulting. It's vulgar. The level of simplicity, the level of bias, and the level of restrictions, the kind of discussions that are done, the kind of analysis and the kind of findings, and the places where the researchers take themselves and they say, oh, they feign surprise when they find something, or when they say, oh, maybe it matters what the person is doing. That the nature of mind wandering, the nature of daydreaming, maybe it depends on what the person is doing. Maybe that the task changes the nature, frequency, and quality of mind wandering. And because of their pre-existing constructed biases, the surprises are also kind of strange. If you're already unfamiliar and unentangled, uninvested in this kind of cognitive neuroscience research of mind wandering, you don't have to get into it. You're better off not getting into it. But if you already are somehow studying mind wandering, I'll encourage you to, and especially if you're suspicious about the limitations of this, if you already have some intuition about this isn't daydreaming, this doesn't cover the richness, the ambiguities, the varieties of what we call daydreaming or mind wandering, then I'll encourage you to take a look at a chapter I wrote recently called The Varieties of Mind Wandering. It's in my book, Experimental Psychology and Human Agency. And it gives a starting point, a rather polite and well-mannered critique of mind-wandering research, which provides, I think, a balancing viewpoint compared to the more dominant approaches. Okay, but more importantly, I wanted to point out in this video the richness of insight in old literature with respect to human psychology, and a lot that we can learn from going back to classic works. Thank you.